Welcome to pattern making class. I'm your college instructor, Annette Julie, and today we are working on making an all-in-one facing. So that means a facing that's going to work for our armhole and our neckline. But at the same time, I'd like to style my front neckline because it looks like it's just a boring copy of the block. So I'm going to go ahead and make a square neckline. I'm going to come in a couple inches and I'm going to go down. So I went in 2 inches and I'm going to go down probably about 6 inches. And I'm going to bring that neckline across. And I'm going to bring that neckline down and give myself a styled square cutaway neckline. That looks nice. So we're going to cut away that whole part. I'm working on the basic bodice, but you could use any bodice. And this is the front that we're working with right now. This does not have seam allowance on it, so seam allowance will need to be put everywhere. But we're going to develop a all-in-one facing for this square neckline. Go ahead and grab a piece of paper that's large enough to be folded and go over to the armhole. Let's go ahead and grab a grain line. There's the middle of my paper. Placing that grain line. Going to fold the paper so it's double. And this is what I would do with the front bodice as well. Lay it down. That looks good. Now we're going to copy off shoulder, and our neckline. Going to come over to the armhole. Going to copy off armhole. I'm not transferring the notch though. And then it looks like I could use a little bit more paper for the side seam. So I'm just going to trim right here. Get myself a little bit of extra paper. I always like to work with the scraps that I have. That looks good. Placing that back on. Continuing to trace my side seam. And now I can go ahead and lift up my front square neckline bodice. I'm going to go ahead and put seam allowance in the pattern. I'm just going to trim away a little bit of extra paper that might be not attractive to look at right now. So we'll just trim a little bit away there. Also too, I'm going to grab another little scrap. And for my back side seam underneath, you can go ahead and tape on a little bit extra paper. Now, let's go ahead and design this facing. This is 2 inches wide. So down here, this could be 2 inches wide, but it could also be just 1.5 inches. So I'm going to draw 1.5 inches below my neckline. And it happens to just line up with my side seam. I could carry that line all the way across like that. Don't need to add any seam allowance on the bottom edge, but we would need to add seam allowance here on the side seam because there isn't any on our bodice right now. We would need to add it on our bodice as well. And we also want to go ahead and put seam allowance in our armhole and on our shoulder and on our whole neckline. Let's go ahead and start here with the neckline. 1/4 inch. This is because we're putting in our facing. We just need 1/4 inch. And this is an all-in-one facing. And then here on the shoulder, we need to drop the shoulder down a little bit. We're going to bring our neckline in a little bit, just like 1/8 inch on the outer edge, 1/8 inch on the inner edge. Blend that back in. Let's go ahead and add our seam allowance here for the shoulder. And if you want, you could also take this down here at the low point of the shoulder. That could also come down that 1/16. Brought that in. Brought that in. Let's add our 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to continue with my seam allowance in my armhole. Since I brought that in that 1/8 inch, now I can add my 1/4. I'm going to rotate this around on the armhole, little 1/4 inch. I'll come back with the curve ruler and connect everything. And that looks good. Neaten up my pattern a little bit. Grab my curve ruler. Let's go ahead and connect those lines. I went in that 1/8 inch to help this be a facing and roll the seam inside as opposed to having the seam on the edge at the shoulder where we would notice it. We're blending our seam allowance in our armhole, 1/4 inch. And this is for a facing. If we had a sleeve, the seam allowance would be 1/2 inch. And we wouldn't need a facing in the armhole. But this is going to be for a sleeveless garment. And so we need our little facing. And look, we went in an extra 1/8 inch right there to roll the seam in. Cutting out our lower curve, heading towards the side seam, and I've kept the inside of the neckline still intact. I have not cut away the paper. Leave this in. Go ahead and cut the armhole first. Then here on the facing, you may bring that in 1/8 inch at the bottom to nothing. to eliminate some bulk. Trim up that side seam. And now we're ready to cut out the inner part of the neckline after we have cut the rest of it, because we want to try to leave our two pieces of paper together so that we can cut easily. And we are making an all-in-one facing, also known as a combined facing. And that looks good. Let's go ahead and get our grain line on here. Grab our ruler. There's our grain line and our arrows going both directions. And this would be our all-in-one facing for our square neckline. Also, this is known as a combination facing. And this is also our front. Get the size on there, your name, the date. Also, we would cut one in self fabric. Also, you would cut one in interfacing. You can underline that in red to show it's interfacing. Do a little circle there. And this facing is looking really good. There could be one other thing you could do to help save fabric and help with the fit. If you wanted to, you could curve that line up like that, because this facing is going up over the bust mound. We don't want anything to be tight. And it would also help with the marker. So that's an option to go ahead and bring that curve line up and across. To be straight on the bottom edge, or come up a little curved right through the strap area, and then come back down to being 1.5 inches. And there is our front, all-in-one facing. And we have butterflied it, so we have the full pattern piece now. And then this goes into our square neckline, but we would need to add seam allowance on our whole bodice here. And this is Annette Julie, and I look forward to you checking out one of my next videos.